refractography. They stimulated and they found thresholds, and then later they went in and measured on postoperative MRIs where they were at the margins of the tumor resection and measured the distance from that to the corticospinal tract and compared that with the threshold. So they would be looking at something like this, a reconstruction of where the tumor used to be and where the CST was, and the closest point of contact was presumed to be the lowest threshold spot, but obviously not directly confirmed because it's all being done after the fact. But the data was rather interesting because when they graphed threshold versus distance, you see here that there's a pretty nice relationship between the closer you are to the corticospinal tract, the lower the threshold is, and it's just about 1 milliamp per millimeter. You can take any point there, take 10 millimeters, go up to the line and cross over, and there's 10 milliamps. It's almost too good to be true. So we need to replicate it. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. And move to another country, Israel. They used intraoperative ultrasound rather than postoperative MRIs to measure the distance. So you're seeing a MRI and DTI, looking at a distance from, in this case, the falx to the corticospinal tract, originally 9 millimeters. Preoperative, intraoperative ultrasound shows you it was only 6 millimeters. They use this intraoperative ultrasound to correct for the movement of the corticospinal tract with resection of the tumor, and so they correct the 9 millimeter distance to 6 millimeters and get a threshold of 5.7 milliamps. Ooh, again, pretty close to 1 millimeter per milliamp. Here's some examples of this subcortical rapid train MEPs. At 20 milliamps, A on the right, they see no response. They're 20 millimeters away, and so you see no response up to 24 milliamps. B, they measure it at 8 millimeters, and the threshold is about 4 milliamps. Well, that's not perfect. That's close. Remember, this is only one data point. And C, the lower right, they measured the distance as only 1 millimeter and got a threshold of 0.6 milliamps. And if you plot all the data, again, here we have this wonderful graph showing a nice relationship, approximately 1 milliamp per millimeter, the actual regression line, 0.97 milliamps per millimeter. Okay, 1 to 1 is a bit easier to remember, and so that's what we go with. But hey, this is only 2 countries that have used 2 different methods and come up with the same thing. So we need to go to the third country, Texas. Great Republic of Texas. I grew up in Texas, and there were those in my childhood who wished that Texas was still a republic. But they used yet another method, integrated functional mapping with navigation. And when I saw this slide, I went, oh, why didn't I think of that? So here is a 1 millimeter ball tip probe, and they've just got the reflective spheres of the neuronavigation attached to the handle, and they register it. And now you put that probe down there, and the navigation screens show exactly where it is, and the electrical stimulation shows you what the threshold is. And so they can measure distance, measure current, and correlate them again. And here's some examples: 12 millimeters away and a threshold of 14 milliamps for the upper extremity, 18 for the lower, so they were probably closer to the upper extremity part of the internal capsule than the lower extremity part. But again, pretty close to 1 milliamp per millimeter, so Yamamoto was right the first time. So there's 3 different studies using 3 different methods for correcting the distance: postoperative MRI, intraoperative ultrasound, and intraoperative MRI, neuronavigation. They all use similar parameters, a train of about 5 300 hertz, pulse widths in the 0.3 millisecond range, and going up to 25 milliampere. Almost too good to be true, but the data are remarkably consistent. So this 1 milliampere per millimeter is now kind of the what's the word I'm looking for? Not the gold standard, but okay. Just noticed that there's a question about NTP phase reversal, motor mapping, combining of the reference bipolar. Definitely monopolar referential montage for phase mapping of the NTP. That's going back to much earlier, but it's much, much easier to interpret if you just use a distant reference and monopolar recordings to each of the contacts. Sorry, I have the slides zoomed in so that I can read them here, and so I have to periodically remember to go back and check for the questions. I apologize for that. Now we're going to yet another country, Switzerland, and here's another one of those things that when I saw it, I said, I wish I had thought of that. And actually, I did think of this, and I started to patent this idea, and then the patent attorney moved out of town and never finished patenting it, and somebody else finally came up and did it, and here it is. Look at the bottom part of this, a Fraser suction with an electrical contact and an insulated cover so that the tip of it is electrified. And as you know, surgeon almost always has suction. I mean, when does the surgeon not have a suction in her left hand? And whatever other instrument in her right hand? And the answer to that question is obviously when she's left-handed. And then she uses the suction with her right hand and the CUSA or whatever in the left hand. So there is always suction in the field to dry the field. And if you simply electrify that suction, then you can do this kind of stimulation and how close am I to the corticospinal tract continuously while you're using whatever other instrument you are to remove the tumor. And the technique that the Swiss have developed for this is to simply set the thing at 7 milliamperes. And with that 7 milliamperes, equivalent to 7 millimeters away, as long as you don't get a response, you're at least 7 millimeters from the corticospinal tract, so you can just keep on going. So that's one of those things. Can I keep going fast? I want to keep going fast and get this tumor out. Yeah, we don't have a response. But when you get closer, whoops, ding. Okay, now there's a response. All right, you're within 7 millimeters now. Let's find out exactly how close you are and get a threshold. And the wonderful thing is that this produces better outcomes because now that you can precisely tell how far away you are from the corticospinal tract, you can keep dissecting and not have to stop, a centimeter or 5 millimeters out because you don't want to impinge on the corticospinal tract. You can just keep going and get down to be very close. And here's the data from the Swiss group. And you see, on the right, when you were above 10 milliamps, there were no deficits either the day after surgery, the day of discharge, or 3 months after. But if you go all the way over to the left, the one that is the most interesting, 1 to 3 milliampere threshold, a good percentage of the patients had some deficits the day after surgery. The deficits were down in the 10 to 15% range the day of discharge, typically 4 or 5 days after surgery these days, and at 3 months after surgery, 0. No new deficits, even though they had gone as close to the corticospinal tract as 1 millimeter, the 1 milliamp threshold. So maximum tumor resection with excellent outcomes because you now know exactly where the tumor is. So now you have a method where you can, in fact, be, I don't know if you want to call this mapping or monitoring, but it's continuous. As long as you're using that suction, you are continuously assessing how far you are away from the subcortical corticospinal tract. And of course, during this, you also presumably have that strip electrode up on the cortex and are doing direct corticomotor remote potential as well. So you got the best of both worlds. And I got to tell you, surgeons love this. they particularly love the electrified Fraser suction. It gives them great confidence. That they're sitting there just sucking away, dry, and all of a sudden say, "Whoops, I got a response." And the fact that they get responses and then you can find the exact threshold, and other times you don't get a response, even if you were to go up to a much higher level, that gives them the confidence that they can now move fast here, but they'll be alerted immediately when it's not safe to go fast and they have to go slow. That's the key to getting same-day surgery accomplished, so that you can end the surgery the same day you started it. Are there false negatives using 5 milliamps as your threshold and using direct cortical MEPs at the same time? False negatives would be not seeing the corticospinal tract even though you were close to it. Vern, there haven't been a lot of studies on this done yet. These are all very brand new techniques, but a false negative might be that you see the direct cortical motorable potential, but you're not seeing the response from stimulation. Suggested maybe I wait until the end of the talk and go over the questions. So I think maybe I will do that because it's distracting me and it's probably distracting you. All right. So let's move on to the brainstem and spinal cord for the last part of this talk. I apologize. We are going to run a little bit over time, but not too far, I hope. So here's an example. Showed you part of the slide before, this cavernous malformation in the cerebral peduncles. You see the topography is still maintained there on the right, but it's distorted on the left side where the malformation is. First, obviously, you're going deep now into the brain, so you got to plan a safe approach depending upon exactly where it is. You may have cranial nerves or nuclei involved, and so you have to monitor those appropriately. We'll go into that. It's pretty close quarters down here. You don't know what you're going to get. Upper extremity, lower extremity, maybe even right side, left side, because the midline can be shifted, so you do want to record from all 4 extremities. And again, you can map with direct stimulation using the same kind of techniques that we had before. You see some of the examples here of from older data using the I'm calling the subcortical pinfield method with prolonged trains, but now of course we would do this with just like we have been doing with the brief trains and time lock responses. And of course now if you're down here, there's no contraindication to also having scalp electrodes and doing transcranial motor potentials, because if you're going after a tumor down here, you're obviously not going to expose the motor cortex for a strip electrode. Moving on down to the spinal cord, we have a similar issue. You first have to plan a safe approach. Assuming that the tumor is an intramedullary tumor within the spinal cord, you've got to get inside the spinal cord, and so you have to do a midline myelotomy, and you want to go through the functional midline, not the anatomical midline, because they may not be in the same place, and the anatomical midline may not be straight. So, remembering our anatomy, the dorsal columns don't synapse anywhere in the spinal cord. The first synapse from the big toe is in the brain. It's a bipolar axons that conduct in both directions, which was, of course, the basis for the old neurogenic motorable potential technique, which was shown to be mediated by antidromic conduction in dorsal columns rather than really reflecting true motor responses. But now we can take advantage of this. Again, just a quick review of the anatomy. Recall that as you go across from one side to the other, the upper extremities come in from the lateral side of the spinal cord, or so are added to the lateral side of the pathway. So if you move across from left to right, say in the cervical region, you'll first encounter the pathways from the left upper extremity, then the left lower extremity, then the right lower extremity, and finally the right upper extremity. One way to record this would be just to record SEPs from a set of electrodes that span the dorsal columns from one side to the other. But now you've got to have this fine little electrode that you fabricate, which isn't that easy, and they're not commercially available. And you've got to do some signal averaging, so it's going to take some time. What we showed way back, right, this is over 30 years ago now, we demonstrated that you can stimulate the dorsal columns and record antidromic nerve action potentials from peripheral nerves, and you can even use the NMEP fact that the sensor nerve synapse on the motor nerve, so you can get recordings from peripheral muscles as well. Either way, but by moving the electrode, the stimulating electrode across from left to right, you can map exactly where the change from one lower extremity to the other is, find the area in the midline that may produce no responses, and determine exactly where the midline is. And this antidromic technique turned out to be much faster than reversing it and doing it the other way around, stimulating peripherally and recording from the spinal cord. We made some arguments as to why that might be in this 1986 paper that you can go back and look up if you want to. There is a new technique of stimulating and recording a cortical SCP, and we'll talk briefly about that. But here's the reason why you've got to do this. Again, normal anatomy, beautiful. Normal people don't generally need surgery. People that need surgery are the people that have something that has created an abnormal situation. Two of them shown here. In B, you have a syrinx that is distorting the midline, and so now it's to the left of the anatomical center, and on the lower right, you have a tumor that is distorting the midline, but now it's moving it over to the other direction. And you can't always tell by these surface veins exactly where the midline is, so it's a good idea to map it. Here's an example of a case that we published back in 2002 with who was then a neurosurgery resident, Alfredo Quiñones Hinojosa. Interesting story. There's a book that you might be interested in called Becoming Dr. Q. Alfredo was an illegal immigrant from Mexico and wound up going to Berkeley, where he was captain of the debate team, going to Harvard Medical School, doing a neurosurgery residency at UCSF, went on to become chief of brain tumor surgery at Hopkins, and I think he's now chief of neurosurgery at the Mayo Clinic in Florida. Amazing story. He was very, very prolific as a researcher during his residency, and this is one of the papers that they did during his residency on this case. This is a 12-year-old girl who had a JPA, which you see on the two MRI scans on the left side. It occupied most of her spinal cords, extending from the foramen magnum down to around C3-4. And what we did was stimulate across the cord and record from peripheral nerves or peripheral muscles in the lower extremity. Either one works, and you see some of the traces on the right, whereas on the left side you see responses from left-sided muscles. So you get into the middle of the septum and there's no responses, and then you keep on moving and now you see responses from the right-sided muscles. So it identified the midline, and the key point is that this was identified at several different locations, and there was in fact an S-shaped curve of where the physiological midline was, and a straight incision down the midline of the spinal cord would have transected the right dorsal column. But by correctly identifying the physiological midline, we were able to resect this entire tumor, and the patient walked out of the hospital 5 days later with no deficits. Briefly, technique where you stimulate the spinal cord and record cortical evoked responses. And you can look this paper up. I don't want to go into much details about it, but obviously as you move across the midline, you're stimulating fibers from the left foot area and then right foot area, and so the responses are going to be generated in first one hemisphere and then the other, and so you're going to see some phase reversal of the scalp-recorded SEP. This is not maybe as straightforward as it seems because the foot area of the cortex is not nearly as consistently organized as is the hand area. This hasn't been replicated yet. It may be a little bit slower. I just wanted to include it for sake of completeness. Now, once you're safely in the spinal cord, now you can do what we've been doing all along, which is mapping the cortical spinal tract. Remember, we're still at the level of the upper motor neuron that is the axons of those pyramidal cells in the precentral motor cortex. So transcranial motor evoked potentials obviously can be monitored as often as you can do those, ideally with D waves as well as EMG recordings. That's, of course, another topic for a different talk than this one. And every now and then, or particularly if transcranial MEPs start to deteriorate, then stimulate within the tumor cavity at a low intensity, around 1 milliampere, and if you start getting responses at a low threshold, then that's a good place to stop. There's a recent paper in Journal of Neurosurgery Spine showing MRI of the tumor on the left and an actual intraoperative photograph on the top, and then a lovely artist's rendition of the tumor cavity after the tumor was removed on the bottom right. And the next slide is that blown up. Now here is some examples of responses stimulating at less than 1 milliampere, and you see responses from plenary evidence from the medial gastrocnemius, tibialis anterior muscles at pretty low threshold, all around the bed of that tumor. So again, by periodically stimulating during dissection and obtaining low threshold responses, that's an indication, all right, we're close to the corticospinal tract, good time to halt dissection and move somewhere else. What we don't know yet, bacteria that has been shown to be pretty valid for the brain, does that also work in the spinal cord? We don't know yet. This is fairly new stuff, so stay tuned. Okay, this is my last slide. So just to reiterate, monitoring and mapping are not the same. Ideally, you want to be able to monitor continuously, map as necessary. Once the motor cortex has been exposed and identified, you can use direct cortical stimulation and do continuous monitoring without overt patient movement. And so you can tell the status of the corticospinal tract, again, as often as, every couple of seconds. And immediately, if you see a deterioration in that, then you can alert the surgeon, halt, and then you can go in and map and see if you can find out what's going on. It gives you a nice early warning. Again, the Penfield-Jasper technique of long trains is now obsolete. Brief trains, analogous to TCMEP, are much more specific, produce fewer seizures, so the long train technique is still used for awake cranies with language mapping.